Okay, well, welcome to this other episode of The Little Breakfast. And I'm pleased to say today in this episode, we've got Tara Devlin. Hi, Tara, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Glad to be here.
Yeah, good to have you on The Little Breakfast. And you're looking very cozy there with your candles behind you. It's looking
right.
very, is it Norwegian or what's the name for that?
Hygge, I think. I think that's how you pronounce it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that sounds good pronunciation. Yeah, I forgot what that that actually was, but I am going to be chatting with you today about why justice matters, and there may be people that have heard of you before through things like Tearfund over the years. Just wondering if you could tell us a bit about yourself in terms of what you've maybe been up to, or you're doing now. What's the crack, as I say?
Yes, native of Northern Ireland. So people, if they have kind of seen me before, because I was around with Tearfund Scotland for 16 years, so fair old time, and round and about, kind of mainly doing kind of youth and student stuff, but sometimes speaking to kind of churches and adults and festivals and stuff around Scotland. And then a few years ago, my husband and I went to Jamaica to work in the inner city in Trenchtown. We were involved in a youth and community project there. And then we came back last March, kind of forced by the pandemic to come back a little earlier than planned, and back in Edinburgh now. And I'm working with a local charity based in Edinburgh and the Lothians who support people living with HIV and Hepatitis C.
Right, so you've literally been around the houses and around the world almost, yeah. And now we find ourselves in these unusual circumstances. So thinking about The Little Breakfast, we start and we talk a bit about breakfast. So what would be your average day breakfast?
My average day breakfast, I'm trying to be a bit more healthy at the moment, shed the lockdown excesses. So I have a coffee and some wholemeal toast and some banana.
Right.
Start the day with a bit of fruit.
Well, that's always good, but I'm just trying to picture what that looks like. So is the banana sitting next to the toast, or is it on the toast?
Sliced on the toast, yes.
Okay, sliced on the toast with some nice Irish butter?
No butter, just, being very frugal. I mean, I keep the butter for the weekends with my toasted wheaten bread.
Right.
That's the treat. But midweek, we just keep it kind of plain and simple.
Is it not a little bit dry, like just sitting on top of the bread?
It's not, actually. You should give it a try. There's enough moisture in the banana to make it feel like crunch, and then banana, it's good. Okay,
so comments, is it good without butter or margarine? Answers on a postcard. So what about your nightmare breakfast? What would be a breakfast that you would just be like, oh, that's horrible?
Yeah, my nightmare breakfast would probably be what other people think is probably a very trendy breakfast of latest times, which would be avocado on toast with some mushrooms on the side. That to me is just hideous. I can't get on board with avocados. Not right, and mushrooms are just the food of Satan. I'm just not. I mean, they're a fungus. What more do you need to know?
Well, it's interesting when you say that, because both are sort of a bit slimy, aren't they?
Yeah.
Both the texture is. I mean, I don't mind avocado, but I don't know what all the rage is about it. It just doesn't taste of a lot, and it's a bit gooey. I'm with you on that one. What about your dream breakfast? What's your dream breakfast?
Dream breakfast is an Ulster fry.
It's an Ulster fry.
Yes.
Okay, so people might be listening to this around the world, and they might be saying, "What did that lady just say? What's an Ulster fry?"
So some people might have little other bits and bobs that go on with this, but for me, the four key components of the Ulster fry would be sausage, and none of your square sausage from Scotland here. This would be you call link sausage, but like sausage, Irish sausage. Yeah. Fried egg, and then fried potato bread and soda bread. Yeah. Probably quite regularly you would have bacon there. I can take or leave the bacon. And some people might have other bits and bobs, but those four for me, that's the key components. And the bread is everything.
The bread is, you're right. The bread is everything in Northern Ireland, isn't it? I take it you would have it in Northern Ireland to fulfill the dream, would you?
Well, initially I did think about that, and I thought, I mean, in the closest thing to reality right now, yes, the dream would be to have it at home with mum and dad. But actually, if I could take my mum and dad and we could have our Ulster Fry in Dublin before going to the Aviva for an Ireland game, that would really be the dream. That would just put the icing on the cake there.
Yeah, followed by a drink of something else, probably.
Maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Depends on how well behaved you're being in lockdown. Yeah,
That's true.
So, changing gear, we're going to be thinking about why justice matters, and I've known you over the years in terms of your work in Tearfund, and that's mostly why I'm interested in knowing what you have to say about that. But I guess on a really base level, Tara, how would you describe justice for people that are listening or watching?
Yeah, I think really simply justice is the act of making things right, making things fair. I think that's kind of what it boils down to, really.
Okay, so making things right and making things fair, how does that work in terms of reality, in terms of maybe globally? What does that look like?
Oh, goodness. I mean, I guess it's like, how long's a piece of string?
Yeah.
I mean, I think justice can look like campaigning for structural change and for societal, change. Justice can look like evening up inequalities in our systems, in our financial systems, in our structural systems, and in how things are. We'll maybe kind of come on to some of the specifics of those in a little while.
Yeah.
About justice, I think, comes down to how we spend our money. I remember there was a time with Tearfund where we kind of boiled it down to how you used your voice and your voice and your choice in order to affect things being different. So where we see something that is unjust, being able to say something or do something that contributes toward it being made right.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's an interesting answer about being made right, because we're obviously living in, when you think of the West and you think of developing world and you think of different worldviews around the world, people have different perceptions of what right is, and I guess that's where, from a Christian perspective, I guess we need to attribute a Christian worldview that's coming from the Bible about what we believe is right, because I guess the problem comes, and maybe you've experienced that, we might unpack that a bit more as we go on, but like what people's understanding of justice is presumably affects how we, what we've used that voice for or what we campaign for. And for some people, I mean, certainly in the last few years, even looking in the Western world, when you look at what's happened over the last few years in America, what people's perception is of justice may well have changed, and that leads me on to another question, which is, I guess, some people might say, well, why should Christians care about justice? What would your response be to that?
I think my response would be, you really need to go and read the Bible, because I think it's very clear. I mean, God is a God of justice, but I think his heart for justice is seen all the way through the Bible. But that particularly if you're talking about, making things fair, making things right, he clearly talks about that with regard to people who are, marginalized and poor and downtrodden, the widow, the orphan, the forgotten, those kind of the refugee, number of kind of categories. But essentially, even you just look at the life of Jesus, if whoever was on the outside, he brought in, and I think in all different kinds of ways, God's heart for justice and God's heart for things actually being right and fair, like that's part of who he is, and it's part of how his kingdom should be. And obviously we live in a fallen world and it's not like that, but he instructs his people again and again and again to be on that side, to be on the side of justice, and to be on the side of lifting up the poor, the marginalized, and specifically not to be the ones who are doing the marginalizing or the ones who are exploiting, people and putting them down or out or wherever it might be.
Yeah, so I just want to explore a bit of the tensions there, because I think it would be naive of me to assume that most Christians would be on board with, we should care about justice, right? Now, it could sound absurd to people listening who aren't Christians, or not all people who aren't Christians will care about justice, and equally others will. But there are some Christians who will maybe sort of not agree with that. And I know, and many years ago when I worked with students and you worked with students, one of the classic sort of dividers was, do we get involved in mission stroke evangelism, or do we get involved in social justice? And it was like the two of them were like at ends with each other rather than working together. That actually it's almost like where you can tell someone about Jesus and you can tell them that they need to repent and come to their faith in Jesus. And that's more important than caring for the marginalized, caring for the poor, caring for the downtrodden, making a difference in society. So I think probably those arguments come and go, but they probably haven't gone away. So I don't. Do you want to unpack that a bit in terms of your thinking on that?
I suppose I've just come to the place now where I kind of feel like it's almost like it feels to me like a red herring.
Yeah.
That and a false separation of our understanding of what it is to really follow Jesus.
Yeah.
And that actually the way I see it, the way I understand the Bible is that, if I am a follower of Jesus, then it's a no-brainer that of course I am going to want to share him with other people and tell other people who he is. But equally, I'm also going to care passionately about people and about justice, because that's just part of what I do. It's almost like somewhere along the way we got this understanding that we can't do both. And I don't know where that came from, because I kind of, the way I say it is like, no, we're meant to do both. And it's not like it's not that if I kind of sit here and say, well, I've told somebody about Jesus today, so I can't possibly campaign to my MP about the situation down the road that's unfair, because I only believe in telling people about Jesus. I don't believe in also making sure those people are being cared for properly. I just think, I think it's probably just been a bit of a red herring, but that as Christians, we love to get ourselves caught up in a nice argument with each other. I think it's unhelpful.
Yeah, what is it? We're absolutely right. I think one thing that I found really helpful over the past couple of years, and a helpful book on that, is Tim Keller's book, Generous Justice. And in Generous Justice, he's coming from more of a reformed position, but I think it's really interesting that he talks about those who are really keen on justification by faith tend not to be as keen on sort of the practical outworkings of justice. Those who are really keen on the practical outworkings of justice sometimes can not be as keen on the kind of biblical theological understanding of justification by faith. And I think he's got a good point there, because actually his premise would be, if you truly believe in justification, then you need to have an outworking of justice from that, right? So because actually God's shown his grace to us, and we show his grace to other people. But I just kind of wonder, as someone that's a pastor, and what I see in culture, what I see in church life, not just our church, but in other churches, how much have we in the West really understood what it is to love our neighbor? And I think that, so the same, if there's justice that's been shown to us, then we should show justice to others. If there's the love of God that's been shown to us, then we should show the love of God to others. But I just think it's so there's so much unpacking that needs to happen there, because I think for many of us, we think the love of God is, oh, well, I'll be nice to, oh, hi, how you doing? Nice day. Or put your bin out, or wheeled your wheelie bin up. Or, we're asking about somebody's family, how they're doing, and we're nice and we're kind to people. But when we're talking about the love of God being made known in terms of the fullness of that and justice, it's so much deeper, isn't it? And I think it's so much more challenging. And I just don't know whether in the West, but particularly in Scotland and in Edinburgh, how much have we understood what it means to really truly love our neighbour? I mean, not just to be nice and say, oh, it's a bit cold today, isn't it? Do you know what I mean by that? I mean, have you got any thoughts on that, like in terms of the depths and the gravity of what God's love looks like and how that intersects with justice?
I suppose one of the first things that comes to mind, and maybe it's because I was just chatting with somebody about this earlier on this afternoon, is that, and I think particularly for those of us who are in quite middle class churches, which, let's face it, is actually most of our churches, or certainly, comfortable. We if we think about justice or poverty or any of these kind of issues, the way that we respond to them, either individually or corporately, is by writing a check. It's still at a kind of comfortable arm's length distance, and it doesn't challenge me. It actually, and if I'm honest, it doesn't really cost me anything. I'm giving out of what I can kind of still easily afford, or maybe sometimes I'm a bit sacrificial in my giving towards something. But I remember being really challenged years ago when I worked for Tearfund, and I talked about poverty and justice all the time. And I read The Irresistible Revolution by Claiborne. And he talked about, when Jesus talks about, I was hungry and you fed me. And he says, it's you, it's personal. He doesn't say, I was hungry and you wrote a check to the Salvation Army and they fed me. And he talked about how for so many Christians, we're actually just really removed from, issues of poverty and justice. And if we do care about them, we do want to do something about them, we still do it in this very kind of clean-cut, removed way, and not really in a way that costs us anything more than maybe a bit of money. And actually, I think we need to get a whole lot closer to the issues to really understand. And this is where I think maybe when we do look at, the developing world and people who really understand, not just there's plenty of people, examples of people doing this in the UK, people who are genuinely right in amongst it, caring for, loving their neighbours, campaigning for fair treatment of their town, their city, or whatever. But I think the Christians in the developing world know how to do this, and we need to learn from them.
So that leads us on to thinking a bit about like your own experience of that. Like, what has been your own experience of engaging in justice? Do you have any stories that can unpack some of that?
I mean, I guess it's quite varied in terms of how I've related to that. And I've done, in lots of ways, I've done what I've just said. I've been that person. That's why that bit in the Jane Claiborne's book really challenged me, because I kind of thought, I recognized myself in those pages, and he went on to kind of say, there's plenty of people who talk about loving the poor, but don't know the name of a single poor person or person living in poverty, because it was all at arm's length, and just, really feeling that challenge of what does it look like to make this more personal and more costly, and in some ways we've done that when we've gone over to Jamaica and really kind of seen that and kind of maybe lived in that a little bit more. But I think it's also, I saw a quote recently from a thing that Tearfund youth team did all to do around the issue of kind of race and responding to that injustice. And it's one of the guys, and I don't know his name, but he had said, when all is said and done, let there be more that's been done than's been said.
Mm.
And again, that was something that really challenged me, because I thought, man, I can talk a good game about justice. I can talk a good game about all this stuff. But actually, do I make the time to make sure that my actions are lining up with what I say I believe, and with what I say that I believe that God expects of me? So I suppose my most recent example, literally in this last week, has been a lady who I met in Jamaica 2 years ago, who I had a conversation with about Scotland's legacy in Jamaica and slavery and reparation. And I spoke to her and I said, you know, what would you want? And in the first instance, she just said, I want an apology. No one has ever said sorry for what happened here. And at the time I said to her, you know, I can't bring you an apology from the British government. I can't bring you an apology from the Scottish government. I can bring you mine.
Yeah.
But I can also tell you that I will go and I will ask for one for you. And it was not until last week, it had been in my mind to still say, you know, at some point I need to write that letter. At some point I need to speak and use my voice as a citizen of this nation and ask the highest powers in the land to right, or to begin to right this wrong. And it took me until this week to actually sit down and put pen to paper. And so I wrote to Nicola Sturgeon and I asked her, told her about this interaction with this lady, asked her about apologising on behalf of Scotland. But as part of that said, actually one way of beginning to make reparation might be around the issue of vaccines, because there's been a lot of stuff, if anybody's been watching the news in the last couple of weeks, about the fact that actually globally there's a huge injustice in how COVID vaccines are being distributed. And Jamaica will be one of those countries that will be at least a couple of years behind Scotland in terms of being able to access and afford the vaccine.
Yeah.
And so I suggested that one way to begin a journey of reparation would be for Scotland to contribute to Jamaica's vaccine programme. So we'll see whether she comes back. But it was, you don't mean it took me a long time even with that to be like, this is something I care about and I'm passionate about. But at some point I actually need to sit down and do the work. Yeah.
No, that's good actually, because I think it's helping me think about how I can engage in that in different ways. So I mean, I give an example, you know, I mean, like if you know, an obvious thing would be to say, right, okay, we need to care for the poor in Edinburgh, right, okay, get involved in Bethany caravan or do meals. But I also think, I mean, I was having a conversation with my wife about this, Grace, who has a very strong helps gift and is a nurse, and you know, for her it's like, oh, that's something she would absolutely does love doing, you know, getting out there and helping and making meals for people. But we're all different, aren't we? And so what we're not saying by this is care about justice, and basically if you can get out there and wash and clothe and feed people, then you're doing really well. But if you can't do that, you're a slacker. I get your point that you can be at arm's length by just writing a check, but maybe some of us have got other opportunities to be a voice. And one of the things that I have done over the years with music is, you know, work closely with the Mission Aviation Fellowship. I know David and Yvonne Lyon have worked with Tearfund and have tried to raise awareness of the work that charities are doing. And that can sound, I don't mean that to sound like cliche and naff, like musicians flagging up the work of people like that. But I think there is, I guess what I'm trying to get at is we're all gifted in different ways and we all have different ways of contributing to that conversation, don't we? Or helping people. And what I was thinking in my mind as you were saying that is it not the case that it's about finding out how we can help against injustice and then using our gifts and who God has made us towards that?
Yeah, I think in some ways there's a bit of a both and. I think absolutely there's something about, you know, asking God to lay on our heart maybe particular issues that we care about, you know, because it also is that thing of like, well, there's just so much injustice in the world, like from your doorstep to the other side of the globe, like where do you even start? And so I think part of it is being able to kind of just ask God to maybe just lay a couple of things on your heart that you specifically want to focus your attention on, and then to be able to kind of say, okay, well, if those are the things I'm going to care about, what does it look like to make a difference for those things? And then, where does my particular blend of talents and gifts and position put me so that I can use those things towards that? I mean, I would say that there are still things like around something like campaigning, is that actually sometimes just lending your voice to something to create a mass kind of push towards changing something is still like, none of us need to be massively gifted to write an email or, you know, sign a petition or whatever it might be. But I think there is something really important about saying, what do I care about and what can I do? And put those two things together and say, right, this is how I'm going to uniquely as me tackle this.
So I think what you said there helps towards thinking about, okay, we can have this discussion about justice and how as Christians it's a rightful thing. There's lots of stuff in the Bible about how we should care for the, you know, the widow, the orphan, the downtrodden, the marginalized. But, you know, what does it really look like on a day-to-day local basis? And I guess I hope this isn't too unfair or difficult an example, Tara, but like imagine if you lived in Morningside in Edinburgh. Like, so if people don't know Edinburgh, like it's a wealthier part of Edinburgh. If there isn't as much immediate poverty on the doorstep, and maybe this bounces off the back of what you've just said. Like, say somebody's listening to this in somewhere like Morningside or another, you know, Manhattan in New York or something. There isn't as much immediate poverty on their doorstep. What could you suggest somebody could do to sort of actually, how can I act in a way that's just towards other people?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one of the first things I would say is that there's always a lot more poverty than you think there is, even in the places where you don't think it will be. And that also it's not necessarily, there's all kinds of poverty and there's all kinds of injustice. And I think, you know, part of it is being able to, I think in lots of ways, unless, you know, we maybe, I don't know, maybe it's a city thing. I think we've maybe lost a way of being engaged in our community and actually just finding out what's going on. You know, and maybe it's Morningside, but, you know, in your Morningside, I'm in Balerno, leafy outer, you know, suburb of Edinburgh. There will be injustice and poverty that isn't maybe always immediately obvious, but it's getting involved, it's opening your eyes, it's reading, it's understanding what's going on in this city. Maybe even if I don't know specifically what's going on in Morningside, there's no shortage of what's going on in Edinburgh to figure out. And then, you know, how does that cross over with me and where I am?
And I think that's right in terms of community, like knowing what's going on in your community. But I mean, when we talk about loving our neighbor, and how well are we doing that? You know, obviously you've got your immediate street, you've got your immediate neighborhood. But in terms of some of the challenges that we're talking about here, I wonder whether it's partly a sort of biblical, theological worldview that actually we need, as opposed to just adopting a consumeristic worldview, an individualistic worldview that we've adopted in the church, by which I mean, do we actually know what's going on in the lives of other people in church, regardless of outside of church? Do we know the marginalized people? Do we know the people that need encouragement? Do we know the people who've got challenges, the people that have got struggles, you know? And I think that there is this kind of challenge that I'm sensing, God saying that, you know, to love your neighbor and to act justly, it's got to start with, compassion that he has for people and wanting to see things as he sees things. And I guess the danger of where we've been at pre-pandemic is that we go to church, we hear the songs, we hear the sermon, we have a cup of tea, we have a chat. Do we really know what's going on in one another's lives? And how can we act justly within the church and outside of the church too? So it seems to me that, when you look at the book of James, if there's favoritism and if there's injustice that's happening within the church, then it's actually not going to be a mark of love to those people that are in the community. And we probably need to, I think this is part of this whole kind of refining process that God's doing at this time, is that we need to have a look at ourselves as Christians and say, well, am I acting with compassion? Am I acting justly? Am I thinking beyond myself? And I know that might sound a bit harsh, but I think it's true that we need to take stock of, what is the mark of a Christian? How will people know that we're Christians? By a love for one another and by a love for others, surely. And that's not a kind of a namby-pamby thing. It's the nitty, sort of grounded stuff that we're talking about in terms of justice, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that Micah 6:8 is kind of, like, what does God require of you? It's like to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God.
Yeah.
It's right there at the top,
Yeah.
acting justly and how you behave. Because essentially we can all talk about the things we say we value, but actually our values are shown in how we behave.
Yeah.
Our values are shown in how we spend our time. Our values are shown in how we spend our money.
Yeah.
And so, there's maybe an opportunity at this time to do a little bit of a stock take of, I can say that these are my values. Over here, as a good Christian, I'll kind of name some values. Actually, am I living out of those?
Yeah.
And is it reflected in my time and my money and my choices? And some of that will inevitably should then look like how I am responding to what I see around me.
Yeah.
Whether that's literally my church neighbor, my next door neighbor, or in a slightly wider, vicinity.
Yeah. I was thinking that's a helpful description, because, like, if you said, for instance, I mean, at the moment, none of us can go anywhere, right, in terms of holiday, but it kind of struck me that there's implications, like, for instance, on, like, say you wanted to go on holiday abroad, right? You could say, I'm going to go all the way to Australia or something like that, or New Zealand on holiday. Now, you could actually say, I'm not going to go that far. That will be better for the environment. I won't spend as much money. And by not spending as much money, and I will give that money away or help people that are in need. Do you know what I mean? Now, I'm not suggesting that people shouldn't have a holiday. I'm not suggesting that we live in an entirely frugal way. But I think but what I'm trying to do is join up the dots of what you're saying, is that actually, if we're to think about acting justly and be humble before God, do we need to think about the stewardship of our money, the stewardship of our time, the stewardship of the environment? Does that make sense? Or am I being too harsh there?
No, I don't think so. And I think part of it is there's definitely something around stewardship and particularly stewardship. I was going to say particularly stewardship of the environment, but maybe it is stewardship of everything that is connected to justice.
Yeah.
And I remember reading something that Jen Hatmaker wrote a little while ago, talking about Americans. She was talking about in terms of dollars, but she was talking about like money. And she said, if I imagine every dollar I have is like a little soldier, and I direct my troops in terms of where they go and what they do. And actually this is a resource that I get to use, and I could send them all my way. I can send them all into my house. I can send them all into my belly. I can send them all wherever. Yeah. But actually when I start to think of them as troops to be marshaled by God for his purposes and for his kingdom,
yeah,
actually how I steward those suddenly feels a little bit different. And it's kind of like, actually these can do something. These troops can go and make a difference. Where will I send them? What will I do with them?
Yeah.
In terms of how we steward the environment, you know, I mean, that's almost like a whole other conversation all by itself. But
yeah,
again, for those of us who are in the kind of wealthy West, it's a bit of an inconvenience when issues of climate change are coming up. But actually we know, and we have known for a number of years, that issues of climate change are affecting the poor the first and the hardest.
Yeah.
You know, they are already have been experiencing, you know, poor communities around the world have been experiencing the feel of climate change for a long time, and in ways that to them are devastating because they don't have the safety net and they don't have, you know, all of the things that we have here. So I think all of those things are about justice, and it's not about trying to hit ourselves over the head and not allow ourselves any kind of treat or luxury or any of those things, but it's just about stewarding them well.
But I agree, but I think at the same time, I think, what is there not a sense in which we in the West have a degree of entitlement by which we sort of think, well, I work hard, I deserve, you know, 4 long-haul holidays a year, or I work hard, I deserve that car, you know, I work hard, I deserve those new clothes. And it's like, you know what I mean? That is total entitlement. And actually part of the stewardship of that is surely, you know, justice is about us not hoarding, you know. And I think we definitely can be guilty of that in the West. And, you know, if I was like to say something about holidays, then somebody might say, well, you know, what computer do you use? You've got a Mac, or is that really a good use of steward? And we could go around in circles, but I do think we need probably to think wisely, like about, it's not just about giving 10% of our money, it's about, okay, we're giving out of our wealth, you know, compared to the rest of the world, you know, we're giving out of the abundance that we've been given. And as we face the kind of culture of scarcity now, where we've got less opportunities to do things, there's restrictions, there's things, people are losing jobs, people have been furloughed, you know, I wonder whether this is an opportunity for us to say, you know, okay, we have been given so much blessing. How do we actually use our resources to bless others? And the gospel is about abundance. It's not about a prosperity gospel, but actually God has come to give us life in full, not to hoard that, but to bless others with that, to enlarge other people's lives with it globally, isn't it? And I think for me, you know, that's one of the things that's coming out of the pandemic, is that yes, there's much scarcity, but actually the gospel offers abundance, and we need to demonstrate that. I need to demonstrate that in how we love our neighbor and how we're marked as being different, and not just like, yeah, it's really terrible, you know, we can't go abroad on holiday, yeah, it's really terrible, you can't go to the cinema, you know, the world is doom and gloom, it's really bad. Actually, you know, we have such a different life given to us in God, but also an opportunity to demonstrate the goodness of the gospel, I think, in its entirety. But have you got any thoughts on how the pandemic has changed things in terms of your thoughts on justice or opportunities to be able to help others?
I mean, I hope that maybe for some people it has brought things a little bit closer. You know, I think that there's kind of quite a thing that a lot of people have said, it's like, you know, yes, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And that actually it has maybe highlighted some of the inequalities that have already been there in our country and in our systems, and it has maybe begun to shine a light on them a little bit more, and allow for people to see that and understand that a little bit. I mean, it's interesting you talking about the idea of scarcity. The thing that came to my mind there was, I can't remember whether it's a Gandhi quote or somebody else, but where they talk about, there's enough on earth for every man's need, but not for every man's greed. And actually there is still an abundance of resources in the country and on the planet. It's just not being shared equitably. And whether you take that on a local level or a national level, or like we were talking about earlier, even with something like the vaccines on a global level, there is enough. There is enough. We need to be open-handed. There's a passage in, I'm trying to think which one it is, whether it's Deuteronomy, but when God's kind of outlining it's almost like his economic plan of like, this is how I want my people to respond, and it's all about the kind of the year of Jubilee and that whole kind of section, and he talks about not being tight-fisted and withholding stuff. He said, I want my people to be open-handed with what you have and to share willingly with others. But actually everything in our society up until this point and still teaches us, like you were saying, it's the entitlement, it's mine. I've worked for this and I'm going to build a fence around it or put up a wall about it, whatever it might be. And actually, in God's economy, there is enough, but it takes those of us who've got stuff in our hands to open our hands and release it and share it.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think the word that comes to me in that is about generosity, and I think that's where Tim Keller's book was really helpful in terms of generous justice. It's not just like giving a bit of justice, that understanding justice in its entirety is actually should lead us to generous living, because we've been shown so much. And it's interesting in his book, he talks about there's a strong link with understanding forgiveness and caring for the poor. If you properly understand forgiveness, then you will really, grow in your care for the poor. And in James 2:26, it says, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. And, so it's like, we've got to look at one another's lives and say, well, actually, if we are not demonstrating the gospel, not caring for people, not loving people, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. So there should be that looking out for in one another's lives. Are we actually living this out? Are we actually caring for people? And as simply as loving God and loving your neighbor, we just need to unpack a bit that ourselves. Like, what does that mean for me to love my neighbor?
Yeah. But I think just going back actually as well, kind of looping this around to the question you were asking earlier about the whole, social action versus preaching the gospel thing. The thing that I've always found really interesting, so in that bit in Deuteronomy 15, where he's talking about how his people should live, and he's talking about, be open-handed and freely lend to wherever you give. And he's saying that there shouldn't be any needy people among you, because the way you are living will be being open-handed and sharing everything that you have and resetting the bar once every generation so that nobody's born into poverty. He's like, this is going to be the mark of how my people live and behave. Yeah. And then you look at the church in Acts, where it says people brought what they had, they sold it, they brought it all, they divided it equitably. There was no poor among them. Yeah. And God added to their number daily those who were being saved. Yeah. And it's like, is it any wonder? Because who wouldn't want to be part of a community where everyone was cared for? And so I kind of think we've lost a key part of the attraction of the good news of the Bible, that we've kind of said, the good news of the Bible is that Jesus died to forgive you for your sins so that you can go to heaven and not hell.
Yeah.
Rather than it being this open and expansive good news that actually here and now there is family and community and enough for everyone.
Yeah.
And that there is something that is so extravagantly generous and attractive about that people will flock to it.
Yeah, and that, I think that's going back to that Keller's point. If you truly know forgiveness, the overflow of that is that you will live and act differently. That you will actually act justly, and you're absolutely right. Because I think it would kind of be like in a lot of churches, if you turn around and said, yeah, nobody here is poor, nobody here is struggling. In fact, everyone's really distributed the wealth quite evenly. People will be like, what? On the one hand, that's a bit weird, but actually you're right. Biblically, that's the way it should be. And therefore it comes back to that question of stewardship. It's not a case of, right, I just give them 10% and I've done that tick. And then I work hard, so I'll play hard. There needs to be a radical rethink about how the community of God lives itself first. And the way that we radically live different will be attractive to the world. It will be a marker, but I just don't think we're anywhere near that. I think in fact, we just live more like the world in terms of our understanding of stewardship. And I think that's partly because when we don't think biblically and critically, we just adopt the ways of, oh, well, this is our culture, this is the way that we live. And it sounds too radical that somebody has a field and they sell it and they give the money to the work of the church, as it did in Acts. It's like, yeah, well, obviously that guy was a bit over enthusiastic, but it seems to me that in a sort of cynical, skeptical, post-Christian country that we live in the UK, that people aren't saying, okay, what must I do to be saved? I think the church is doing an amazing job. More often than not, I think we're moaning and complaining like society. And actually, I just wonder whether this pandemic is a pivotal moment here for us to sort of say, how are we actually living? How shall we live? As Schaefer spoke about, how then shall we live as Christians? And when you think about Francis Schaeffer and Labrie, that spent so much time looking at intellectually, like theologically, how we live, but actually then how you demonstrate that as community, how you live out life as community. As one example, among many over the generations, I just think actually, is this a time for us to seriously have a look at ourselves and say, are we living as Christians, or are we living like people of the world who call ourselves Christians,
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful challenge for us to think about. And I think for a lot of us in the West, we live exactly like the rest of our culture, except for the fact that we believe in Jesus, and but it's not impacting enough. Nobody can tell the difference. Between us and everybody else. And again, obviously there are exceptions. There are people in the UK, Christians who are really, I think, living it out in that kind of more radical way. But I think for lots of us, our Christianity is just it's a club.
If you go
it's a club we believe in, but it's a club.
Well, Tara, if you go to parts of Northern Ireland, you can tell people are Christians by this big, massive black Bible and the shirt and tie as they walk down the way. No, I'm sorry to my relatives that might be listening in Northern Ireland. There's just some people that live like that. But joking aside, it is almost like I'm distinguishedly different because I do have a big black Bible and I do dress up on a Sunday, or I do wear a hat, and not that I'm absolutely generous and loving and kind and so different to people living just for themselves, and I think by the grace of God, if we can get hold of that. But the only challenge in that is it's going to be a painful process of us learning to die and to actually live by faith, trusting God, not just the paycheck and stuff, like if we're going to be generous in that way, then it's going to take a little bit of honing, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's going to take a lot of deconstructing our lifestyle and trying to separate out our culture from what we actually believe.
Yeah. So in terms of where we might be going, that what we've touched on some of that, but what do you see in terms of culture as we enter this new era? I mean, obviously we've spoken about how we do need to be different. Like, just quickly, I mean, how, and maybe it's a bit of an unfair question just on the hoof, but like, what could we do? Like, so we listen to this podcast, say, oh, that's great. He said that and she said that. Right, okay, I better get my bacon roll now. I may have forgotten what they've said. Like, what could we actually put into action sooner rather than later?
I mean, there is a degree to which that is a bit of a, how long is a piece of string? And I think if somebody is listening to this or watching this and already has a bit of a sense of, do you know what, I know there are some issues that do stir my heart. There are some things in the world that I know are not fair, or that I know are happening locally that are not fair. I just actually, in the first instance, like I had until recently, I actually haven't gotten off my backside and done anything about it. Then actually, my first thing is to figure out what taking action about that thing might be, because I already know what that thing is. I just haven't made it a priority. But I think for people for whom they're kind of just like, I really haven't thought about this very much before, and there is so much going on in the world.
Yeah.
Like there's too much to care about. Where do I start? I think that's where we start, by coming before God and, confessing our selfishness and confessing our greed and our self-centeredness, and saying, okay, God, what, open my eyes. We sing it all the time. Break my heart for what breaks yours. It's an extraordinary prayer if we actually pray it and mean it.
Yeah.
And to be able to just say, would you lay something on my heart, whether it is literally the person that lives across the road, or whether it's an issue or a something that's going on, that I just start to feel it in my gut. I feel a burden for it, and I need to figure out, okay, what is something that I can do to start journeying towards taking action on this. And for all of us, if nothing else, the thing we can start by doing is praying about it. Whatever that action is, or whatever that injustice is.
Yeah.
Is to pray about it. But I think it's always really important to not pray. Like, obviously prayer is awesome, and prayer is one of the most powerful things we can do. But I think sometimes as Christians, we also use it as a way of letting ourselves off the hook of doing anything else.
Yeah.
And actually it's being able to kind of pray for the situation, for the person, for the whatever, and pray for ourselves. And remember that when we pray, part of it should be asking the question and then shutting up and listening for the answer. Of saying, God, what do you want me to do about this?
Yeah.
And see what he says.
Yeah. I think that's right. And, us talking about this, I mean, actually arranging to talk about this has made me think more about this. And if it's more on the radar of our life, and there's more awareness of the need to think about justice as a central part of the gospel, then praying into that and asking God to reveal that, and reveal that in scripture, reveal that in our neighborhoods, reveal that in the world, that we become more sort of tuned into that, because I guess one of my concerns, Tara, is just that with the pandemic, that we've become more inward and more about self-protection as opposed to looking out the way, and what you're saying about Jamaica and other countries, it's absolutely right, that it would be shocking if we had a stockpile of viruses here and we weren't doing anything with them. And we need to be generous again. We are blessed to live in a country where there's an NHS where we get vaccinated, where that happens. And there's many, many countries in the world that will be struggling so much more with COVID than us. So it's about, I guess, lifting our eyes to God and lifting our eyes out the way, isn't it? And being aware. And a lot of that stuff is the thinking about what it means to live in the kingdom of God, and blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are those who mourn, and thinking about that Sermon on the Mount is all in there, isn't it? It's all in there. It's just, we just have to read it and actually live it out.
I was going to say, we need to. We don't need to go much further than the words of Jesus. I mean, I think when you've been a Christian for a long time, part of the challenge is that we can just really sanitize the words of Jesus. Yeah. When they are hard hitting. Yeah. And we maybe spend a lot of time kind of slightly softening or justifying away what he really meant was that he didn't really, what he was saying, it wasn't really, he didn't actually mean for us to give everything away. He didn't actually mean that. It was just, but actually the words of Jesus are extraordinarily challenging to our lives. Yeah, absolutely. Or they should be. And if they're not, we maybe need to go back and take a fresh look. Yeah. So that's been really helpful just to chat through that. And there's a lot of challenges, as I've spoken about that with you, and other people might equally find that challenging. And what we'll do is give people an opportunity. We've got a Facebook page. People can drop comments or questions in on that. There's a Twitter page and Instagram, but I think probably Facebook is probably easier for a bit of comment interaction. And you might agree with what we've been saying, disagree with what we've been saying. You might know some resources about what we've been talking about too. So, and if you've got anything, I know obviously you've been involved with Tearfund and other things, we might be able to put some links to where people might go to find out more about that. But I think more sobering, for me, it comes back to us being accountable ourselves, doesn't it? Both individually and as churches, saying, okay, what's our response to the reality of a world where there is injustice, and how do we respond to that prayerfully and in action, and not do nothing really, because doing nothing is never an option. Faith without works is dead, isn't it? That's the thing. So okay, well, thanks for taking the time, and pleasure. It's always good to chat and face these challenges and to see what's God's saying. And obviously we're in the middle of this pandemic. We're not quite sure which way it works. But what I would say in that is I think it's encouraging to have these conversations. If change comes about as a result of it, it's not just a case of what an inconvenience, let's get back to where we were before. But actually, if our hearts are softened by this and we're become more compassionate towards others, that's a good thing. Yeah, absolutely. I hope so. Let's hope so. Yeah, let's remember that is the case. Okay, thanks for joining us, and all the best in all that you're doing. As I say, people can get in touch if they want to find out more.